So hello and welcome to this course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at James Joyce's Ulysses. So we had a lecture talking about some of the concerns, some of the style, some of the thematic narratives which inform this particular text, and we talked particularly about how the narrative technique used by Joyce relies a lot on the stream of consciousness technique, in the sense that it cuts back and across time, it cuts back and across space, and we have different characters crisscrossing each other in different narratives. So in a way, this becomes quite similar in some sense to Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is what we just finished prior to this. Like Mrs. Dalloway by Woolf, Ulysses 2 is about one day in Dublin, so it's about one day in one city. Different characters crisscrossing each other in that one calendar day. But of course we know that the whole idea of calendar day in modernism is very superficial, because it just appears as some kind of a structure, temporal structure, inside which we have different kinds of psychological time inhabiting. So people inhabiting different kinds of psychological time, mental time, memory time, psychic time, and all these are obviously complicating the one calendar day time, which is a superficial temporal frame. Okay, so this is the opening line of Ulysses. Well, obviously it's not possible for us to read the entire novel, so like Mrs. Dalloway, we'll look at certain sections. I mean, this is a bigger, a longer, and more bulky novel than Mrs. Dalloway, so we'll look at certain selected passages in the novel in terms of how those connect to some of the concerns we talked about in terms of memory, mourning, masculinity, the whole idea of gender, the whole idea of femininity in Ulysses, because we'll also take a look at some of the characters who are often understudied. For instance, Molly Bloom is a character who is often understudied in Ulysses. So we look at how Molly Bloom's dramatic interior monologue with which Ulysses ends, how that actually foregrounds the female body, the female sexuality, in a way which is quite subversive in quality. Okay, but this is the beginning of the novel, which is in a big tower. This is the Sandycove Tower in Dublin, close to Dublin. Straightly plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather in which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A young dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently behind him on the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, in tribulo ad altere Dei. So again, it's Latin for, I give myself to your altar, for youth, for life. So this is obviously an address to God. So to God's altar I give myself in hope of youth, in hope of eternal youth, in hope of eternal health. Right? So we have Buck Mulligan who comes in here. He's a medical student, and he is someone that co-inhabits the space along with Stephen Dedalus, who is one of the most central characters in Ulysses, and he's the Telemachus version. So, as I just mentioned in the previous lecture, that Ulysses, it conforms to the epic style, the mythic style. And the original myth of Ulysses is obviously Ulysses, the Homeric warrior coming back from a series of wars to his home, and Telemachus' son, who is now ruling, who's now in charge of the island, and Penelope, the wife of Ulysses, who had been visited by different suitors at different points of time, because people had presumed him to be dead. That's the original myth, the original mythical narrative. Now, obviously, that mythic method is used by Joyce to sometimes to parody, sometimes to conform, and sometimes to depart from the original story. So, for instance, in this story, Penelope, Molly Bloom, who happens to be Penelope, the Penelope character, she's not faithful to her husband all the time. So there are episodes, for instance, the last one is entirely with Molly Bloom's subversive sexuality or subversive sexual morality, which is a dramatic departure from the Penelope figure, the Penelope persona in Homer's original epic, original myth. Right, so that mythic method is sustained, and Stephen Dedalus over here, he is the modern version of Telemachus, the son of Leopold Bloom, and Leopold Bloom being Ulysses over here. Okay, so these characters are obviously very loosely structured around the original myth, and Joyce obviously is trying to rewrite the original myth in modern day Dublin, and obviously sometimes there's a degree of deflation, there's a degree of parody, there's a degree of departure from the original this structure, etc. Okay. Halted, he peered down the dark winding stairs and called out coarsely, "Come up, Kinch, come up, you fearful Jesuit." Solemnly he came forward and mounted the round gun rest. He faced about and blessed gravely thrice the tower. The surrounding, this is the Martello Tower in Santa Claus, by the way, where Ulysses opens. He faced about and blessed gravely thrice the tower, the surrounding land, and the the waking mountains. Then catching sight of Stephen Dedalus, he bent towards him and made rapid across in the air, gurgling in his throat and shaking his head. Stephen Dedalus, displeased and sleepy, leaned his arms on the top of the staircase and looked coldly at a shaking, gurgling face that blessed him, a queen in his land, and in the light of untonsured hair, grained and hued like pale oak. Right. So Dedalus comes up sleepy. Dedalus is displeased. Dedalus comes up moody. And Buck Mulligan is someone who's in charge, who's an English medical student here in Dublin. Okay, Buck Mulligan peeped an instant under the mirror and then covered the bowl smartly. Back to barracks, he said sternly. He added in a preacher's tone, for this old dearly beloved is a genuine Christian, body and soul and blood and ounce. Slow music, please. Shut your eyes, gents. One moment. A little trouble about those white corpuscles. Silence, all. So we find that this is obviously, and we discussed already how Ulysses was such a scandal to the Catholic Church. And we find at the very beginning of this novel, we have a medical student who is quoting the scriptures, is quoting the holy phrases, the Latin phrases, only to parody the same, because the Buck Mulligan over here, he doesn't believe in the eternity of the soul. He doesn't believe in the holiness and sacrality of the body either. And very soon we'll talk about Stephen's dead mother. That whole idea of the dead mother being unheeded to the time of her death will come back very quickly. But Buck Mulligan's take on the entire thing about death and life is strictly medical in quality. So him quoting the scriptures, him quoting the Latin lines, the holy lines, obviously carries a parodic significance, which is something that Ulysses is trying to foreground at the very beginning of the novel. Okay, so and then obviously the mockery of Dedalus' name comes in, and as some of you will know, Dedalus was the son of Icarus in the original Greek myth. So Icarus was someone who made this waxen wings to fly away from the prison in which he and Dedalus were imprisoned. And the warning, of course, was not to fly too close to the sun. Or Dedalus becomes he flies close to the sun, and Icarus obviously tries to rescue him, and so Icarus becomes, and both of them die. So Icarus becomes the entire, the whole myth becomes a metaphor of human hubris. Okay, so Dedalus and Icarus, they obviously the father-son relationship. Dedalus becomes the archetypal craftsman, and that craftsman quality is interesting because Dedalus over here, he wants to be the writer, he wants to be the artist, he wants to be the perfect craftsman in that sense. So he's a modern craftsman, he's a modern maker of waxen wings. And if you read the portrait artist as a young man, you find that in the same Dedalus persona is projected over here. So Stephen Dedalus obviously is a struggling writer, and he is co-inhabiting here this particular house with Buck Mulligan, who happens to be a medical student. Okay, he pointed, so the mockery, I mean, his Greek name is Memortad. The mockery of it, he said gaily, "Your absurd name, an ancient Greek." He pointed his finger in friendly jest and went over to the parapet, laughing to himself. Stephen Dedalus stepped up, followed him warily halfway, and sat down on the edge of the gunrest, watching him still as he propped his mirror on the parapet, dipped the brush in the bowl, and lathered cheeks and neck. Now you find that Ulysses is full of this very daily, banal bodily activities. These are two people shaving, and very soon, quickly in the second section, we find Leopold Bloom, who will be defecating, and that to be described in very graphic detail. So all kinds of bodily functions, obviously sexual functions, which will come in later, will be foregrounded and described in vivid graphic details, which obviously was part of the scandal quotient of this book. Okay. Buck Mulligan's gay voice went on. "My name is absurd too. Malachi Mulligan, two ducktails. But it has a Hellenic ring, hasn't it? Tripping and sounding like a buck himself. We must go to Athens. Will you come if I can get the aunt to fork out 20 quid? So the whole idea of going back to Athens becomes interesting because, that becomes, in a sense, going back to Athens is like going back to the center of culture, going back to the center of where it all started from. The whole idea of Mulligan and Daedalus and Icarus and all these Greek myths from which the entire white civilization, so to speak, sort of emanated or blossomed is something which is referred to over here. And interestingly, that Greek the entire Greek origin space, or the Genesis space, is obviously in some kind of a conflict with the Christian idea of origin, the Christian idea of the original story narrative, and so they are obviously undercutting each other in that sense. Will he come? The Jesuit Jesuit, seizing and began to shave with care. Tell me, Mulligan. Stephen said quietly, yes, my love. How long was Hines going to stay in this tower? Buck Mulligan showed a shaven cheek over his right shoulder. God, isn't it dreadful, he said frankly, a ponderous Saxon. He thinks you're not a gentleman. God is bloody English, bursting with money and indigestion, because it comes from Oxford, you know. Dallas, you have the real Oxford manner. He can't make you out. Oh, my name for you is the best kin to the knife blade. He shaved warily over his chin. So we have something similar to what we saw at the end of the short story Araby, if you remember the story Araby, which we did earlier. We had this whole idea of the English versus the Irish tension, and that tension gets manifested in terms of language, in terms of accent, in terms of the manner of speaking, in terms of the choice of words, etc. So Haynes over here is an Englishman who is supposedly in some kind of a tense relationship with Stephen Dedalus over here. Okay, and so this whole conversation about Dedalus and Haynes goes on, and now the whole idea of the dead mother comes up, and the dead mother becomes a very conspicuous absence in the novel. So Dedalus obviously comes from a family of deadness. There's no one alive over here in terms of his parents, and so he becomes very quickly appropriated or appropriable by someone like Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom, who are childless. So they become the surrogate parents, so to speak, the spiritual parents, or the narrative parents, so to speak, of Dedalus in this particular novel. Okay. Now the mother figure becomes interesting because originally the mother figure comes in as a sea figure, so the amniotic quality of the sea is obviously extended into the mother figure, the protector, nurturer figure. That very quickly constitutes the biological mother of Dedalus, who is long since been dead. And the dead mother comes in as a very conspicuous presence in a novel. She keeps coming up as a metaphor of guilt, as a metaphor of unrequited love, as a metaphor of filial ingratitude, a filial lack of duty. So that becomes an interesting point. That becomes almost a traumatic point for Stephen Dedalus, the fact that he did not do something he ought to have done as a son. Okay, right. The aunt thinks you killed your mother, he said. That's why she won't let me have anything to do with you. Someone killed her, Stephen said gloomily. You could have knelt down, damn it, Kinch, when a dying mother asks you. Buck Mulligan said, I'm Hyperborean as much as you, but to think of your mother begging you with her last breath to kneel down and pray for her, and you refuse. There is something sinister in you. So that we get this backstory now. The Dedalus, or Stephen over here, he suffers from this continual guilt, this continual pang of remorse and repentance, because he had not prayed for her mother, his mother, on her deathbed when he implored her, when she implored him to do it, when she begged him to do it on her deathbed. He refused to do it, and this refusal obviously becomes something of a permanent guilt, a permanent marker of guilt and trauma in his mind. Okay. Stephen, an elbow rested on the jagged granite, leaned his palm against the brow and gazed at the fraying edge of the shiny black coat sleeve. Pain, there was not yet the pain of love, fretted his heart. Silently, in a dream, she had come to him after her death. So the posthumous appearance of the mother becomes important. It's a symbolic reminder of Stephen's recursive guilt. She keeps coming back in his dreams as a ghostly spectral character who has obviously long since been dead, and that obviously informs his guilt and trauma even more. So she keeps making appearances in her dream. Silently in a dream she had come to him after her death, her wasted body within its loose brown grave clothes giving off an odour of wax and rosewood, her breath that had been bent upon him, mute, reproachful, a faint odour of wetted ashes. Across a threadbare cuff edge, he saw the sea hailed as a great sweet mother by the well-fed voice beside him. So you have different kinds of mother figures over here. The sea is described as a mother figure, something that's nourishing humankind with its amniotic quality, its endless amniotic quality, the endlessness of love, the endlessness of the sea's resources, obviously in equation with the endlessness of mother's love. And in comparison to that, we have the real mother who was unrequited in her love. Stephen did not return his, her love to her and let her die, being unrequited. Someone who wanted him to do something, requested him to do something, and he failed to do it. He refused to do it. So in his refusal, he had failed to be the good son. So he becomes a spectacular example of the mother figure to him, which in turn reminds him of his guilt, reminds him of his trauma, of his remorse of not having paid heed to his mother's request, the dying request of praying for her on her deathbed. Okay, the ring of bay and skyline held a dull green mass of liquid. A bowl of white china had stood beside her deathbed, holding the green sluggish bile which she had torn out from her rotting liver by fits of loud groaning, vomiting. So you find again very bodily functions, sickly functions. The sick body, the diseased body is foregrounded over here. The body of the dying mother is the first real body to appear in Ulysses. And how does it appear? A bowl of white china had stood beside her deathbed, holding this green sluggish bile which she had torn up from a rotting liver by fits of loud groaning, vomiting. So the greenness of the bile and the greenness of the sea are obviously coming together in Stephen's imagination. So you see the massive sea, who is described as a mother figure, and which is obviously green in color, green in quality, is when equated with the green bile that his mother had coughed up in a deathbed, and that obviously is something which keeps coming up in his dreams. Okay, so right, and then there's an interesting section later where Stephen talks about asks Buck Mulligan a certain question about his dead mother. Before that is a little symbol which I want to spend a little bit of time with. The broken mirror symbol. The broken mirror becomes a very interesting symbol in Ulysses, and Stephen explains this to Buck Mulligan, saying the broken mirror is a symbol of Irish art, but that obviously takes up different political connotations as well. So Stephen bent forward and peered at a mirror held out to him, cleft by a crooked crack, hair on end, as he and others see me. Who chose this face for me? This dog's body, to rid of vermin, it asked me too. I pinched it out of the skivvy's room. Buck Mulligan said, it does her all night, all right. The Underwoods keeps plain-looking servants for malady. Lead him not into temptation. And her name is Ursula. Laughing again, he brought the mirror away from Stephen's peering eyes. A broken mirror. There's a crack in the mirror. The rage of Caliban at not seeing his face in the mirror, he said, if Wilde were only alive to see you. So the reference to Wilde becomes interesting, because Wilde obviously is a metaphor, an archetype to a certain extent of the Irish artist, the Irish wordsmith, or the Irish craftsman in literature. So that is a figure that Stephen obviously aspires to reach, aspires to appropriate. Drawing back and pointing, Stephen said with bitterness, it's a symbol of Irish art, the cracked looking glass of a servant. Buck Mulligan suddenly linked his arm in Stephen's and walked with him around the tower, his razor and mirror clacking in the pocket where he had thrust them. It's not fair to tease you like that, Kinch, he said kindly. God knows he had more spirit than any of them. Buried again. He fears the lancet of my art as I fear that of his, the cold steel pen. Okay, so there's almost like a battle going on, and the battle, some kind of a tension between Buck Mulligan and Stephen, and the question that comes in Stephen's mind will be quite interestingly articulated. Okay, so again, the whole idea of Stephen's mother comes up, the dead mother, and this section is interesting where Stephen asks the question to Buck Mulligan, and remember when he first introduced me to your family, how did he introduce me as? And this section it deserves a bit of a detailed description. Okay, and this is a question that Stephen asks Buck Mulligan. Do you remember the first day when I went to your house after my mother's death? Buck Mulligan frowned quickly and said, what, where? I can't remember anything. I remember only ideas and sensations. Why? What happened in the name of God? You were making tea, Stephen said, and went across the landing to get some more hot water. Your mother and some visitor came out of the drawing room. She asked you who was in her room. Yes, Buck Mulligan said. What did I say? I forget. You said, Stephen answered, oh, it's only to Dallas, whose mother is beastly dead. Right? So again, the whole idea of the mother being beastly dead becomes interesting, and the word beastly, of course, is used in a very English sense, a very upper-class English sense, but it takes up different connotations over here. The beastliness of this is part of the loneliness. She doesn't really get any. She didn't really get any human empathy. She didn't really get any human, prayer, any human touch, any human companionship during her death. So in that sense, it's also beastly. In that sense, it's also quite terribly lonely in quality. So you said, Stephen answered, oh, it's only Dallas whose mother is beastly dead. A flush which made him seem younger and more engaging rose to Buck Mulligan's cheek. Did I say that? He asked. Well, what harm is that? He shook his constraint from him nervously. And what is dead? He asked. Your mother is not yours or my own. You saw only your mother die. And this is the medical section over here, which I mentioned a while ago. How Buck Mulligan looks at the whole experience of death, the whole image of death, the whole body of death as from a medical gaze, which has nothing to do with the metaphysical understanding of death at all. So we have this interesting dialogue going on, so to speak, between the medical and the metaphysical views on the experience of death. So you saw only your mother die. I see them pop up every day in the Meta Enrichment as a place where he works as an apprentice, as a medical student, and cut up into tribes in the dissecting room. It's a beastly thing and nothing else. It simply doesn't matter. So again, the word beastly comes back away in a different connotation this time. So you say, it's a beastly thing. It's something which is, it's nothing to do with any human companionship or a human quality. It's just a body. It's just a cadaver which is cut up in a dissecting room, and we do it all the time as doctors. We're trained to cut dead bodies. We're trained to look at death from a very different perspective, not from a perspective of some metaphysical understanding of mortality, not that at all, but as a very earthly and a bodily phenomenon, as a phenomenon of functionality or dysfunctionality. Okay, the body becoming dysfunctional is what we are interested in as doctors. Okay, it simply doesn't matter. You wouldn't kneel down to pray for your mother on a deathbed when he asks you. Why? Because you have the cursed Jesuit strain in you, only it's injected in the wrong way. To me, it's all a mockery and beastly, what comes back again. Her cerebral lobes are not functioning. She calls the doctor, Sir Peter Teasel, and picks buttercups off her quilt. Humor her till it's over. You cross the last wish in death, and you have to sulk with me because I wouldn't whinge. I don't whinge like some hired mute from Ulysses. Absurd. I suppose I did say it. I didn't mean to offend the memory of her mother. So, we find that Buck Mulligan gets quite defensive over here, and he tells Stephen that, this is a hypocrisy of the highest order. This is rich coming from you, because you wouldn't even humor your mother on her deathbed. You wouldn't even pay heed to her final request for prayers, and yet you are judging me for saying a word, for saying an expression which you think was in poor taste. And then, of course, he apologizes. I didn't mean to offend the memory of your mother. He had spoken himself into boldness. Stephen, shielding the gaping wounds which the words had left in his heart, said very coolly, I'm not thinking about the offense to my mother. Oh, for what then? Buck Mulligan asked. Of the offense to me, Stephen answered. Buck Mulligan swung round on his heel. Oh, an impossible person, he exclaimed. He walked up quickly around the parapet. Stephen stood at his post, gazing over the calm sea towards the headland. Sea and headland now grew dim. Pulses were beating in his eyes, veiling the sight, and he felt the fever of his cheeks. Again, look at the way in which feverishness of the whole experience of having a fever comes back. Again, a bodily function which informs an epiphany experience. So we have an epiphany over here. It's quite embodied in quality. A voice within a tower called loudly, are you up there, Mulligan? I'm coming, Buck Mulligan answered. He turned towards Stephen and said, look at the sea. Why does it care about offences? Chuck Loyola, Kinch, and come on down. The Sassenach warns his morning rashes. So again, the sea is used as a metaphor over here, something which is beyond any human offense, any human insult, any human injury. That's used again as a metaphor for, as like a massive leveler, so to speak. His head halted again for a moment at the top of the staircase, level with the roof. Don't mope over it all day, he said. I'm inconsequent. Give up the moody brooding. So again, this brooding image is something what Stephen is associated with throughout this particular novel. And we find two different kinds of knowledge orders are in dialogue with each other. So Stephen is obviously more metaphysical, more literary, more metaphoric, more imaginative, whereas Buck Mulligan is someone who's quoting Latin all the time, but his grasp in reality is far more material in quality. So because he's a medical practitioner, and his experience in medicine, his treatment in medicine, his training in medicine makes him more earthly, more material driven, compared to Stephen's more metaphysical insights into life, death, and the whole process of the whole experience of living. Okay, so and now again, the question of the dead mother comes up in Stephen's imagination and as some kind of a memory marker. Folded away in the memory of nature with her toys, memories beset his brooding brain. Her glass of water from the kitchen tap when she had approached the sacrament, a cold apple filled with brown sugar, roasting for her at the hob of a dark autumn evening, her shapely fingernails reddened by the blood of squashed lice from the children's shirts. In a dream, silently, she had come to him, her wasted body within its loose grave clothes giving off an odor of wax and rosewood. Her breath bent over him with mute secret words, a faint odor of wetted ashes. Her glazing eyes, staring out of death, to shake and bend my soul, on me alone, the coast candle to light her agony, cozy light on a tortured face, her host loud breath rattling in horror, while all prayed on their knees, her eyes on me to strike me down. So there's something very spectral about this, almost like a retribution-like quality about for not having prayed for the dead mother. The dead mother keeps coming back, not as a nourishing figure, but as a traumatizing figure for Stephen Dedalus. Okay. Goal, chewer of corpses. So the mother becomes Goal. It's like an evil spirit of a curse, a chewer of corpses. No, mother, let me be and let me live. Can't you hide? Buck Mulligan's voice sang from within the tower. It came nearer up the staircase, calling again. Stephen, still trembling at the soul's cry, heard warm running sunlight, and in the air behind him, friendly words. So again, it's like a reverie which is broken, and the reverie is inhabited by the dead mother coming back in a ghostly, ghoulish quality, spectral quality, almost trying to avenge the lack of prayers or the prayerlessness on her deathbed. So she's coming back over and over again as Stephen's imagination, in that kind of a belief system where the dead doesn't find salvation or the soul doesn't find peace unless prayed by the living around them, living companions around them on the deathbed. Okay, so so again, the whole idea of the Cockney accent becomes interesting because we talked about how, if you remember the end of Araby, the short story where the boy goes to the fair Araby, the bazaar Araby, and he finds a couple of men flirting with a woman, and and he observed their English accents, and the English accent obviously is very different from the Irish accent, and so we have Buck Mulligan singing a song. He flung up his hands and tramped down on the stone stairs, singing out of tune with a Cockney accent. Oh, won't we have a merry time, drinking whiskey, beer and wine, on Coronation Day, or won't we have a merry time on Coronation Day? So again, coronation obviously is a royal ritual, but it also becomes a symbolic ritual. So Stephen is obviously the artist to be over here, and this degree of coronation are waiting for him. And this particular nonsense sing-song rhyme that Buck Mulligan sings at this point of time takes up different significance subsequently. Okay. I look at the material objects around this particular landscape now. Warm sunshine marrying over the sea. The nickel shaving bowl shone, forgotten on the parapet. Why should I bring it down or leave it there all day, forgotten friendship? He went over to it, held it in his hands a while, feeling its coolness, smelling the clammy slaver of the leather in which the brush was stuck. So carried the boat of incense then as Clungways. I'm another now and yet the same. A servant too, a server of the servant. So again, it's very, very synesthetic in quality, as you can see. The synesthesia is that state of being where one particular sense triggers another sense, and the two senses merge together. Like for instance, if you had a sense of smell, that can remind you of a sense of sight, and the two senses can merge together in some synesthetic combination. Okay. Now, the figure of the milk woman becomes interesting as well. The milk woman is someone who comes in to deliver the milk to these three men in the morning, and she almost has a quasi mythical quality, some kind of a messenger-like quality by delivering the milk. The doorway was darkened by an entering form. The milk, sir. Come on, ma'am. Mulligan said, Kinch, get the jug. An old woman came forward and stood by Stevens's elbow. That's a lovely morning, sir, she said. Glory be to God. To whom? Mulligan said, glancing at her. Ah, to be sure. Stephen reached back and took the milk jug from the locker. The islanders, Mulligan said to Haynes casually, speak frequently of the collector of prepuces. How much, sir? Asked the old woman. A quarter, as a measurement for milk, Stephen said. He watched her pour into the measure and thence into the jug rich white milk, not hers. Old shrunken paps. She poured again a measureful of and a tilly. All in secret she had entered from a morning world, maybe a messenger. So the word messenger actually arrives. So it's some kind of a mythical messenger-like quality about this woman. Maybe a messenger. She praised the goodness of the milk, pouring it out, crouching by a patient cow at daybreak in the lush field, a witch on a toadstool, her wrinkled fingers quick at the squirting ducks. They load about her whom they knew, dew silky cattle, silk of the kine and the poor old woman, names given her in old times, a wandering crone, lowly form of an immortal serving, her conqueror and a gay betrayer, the common cock queen, a messenger from the secret morning, to serve or to be upbraid whether he could not tell, but scorned to beg a favor. So she appears like a messenger-like quality to Stephen's imagination. And there are certain sections in Ulysses where it almost takes a mythical ambient quality, and ambient quality almost becomes mythical in quality by extension. So this is one of those figures, the old woman that comes in, this very shrunken old woman who comes in to deliver milk, and the countenance of this woman should remind us of the very shrunken appearance of Tiresias, who appeared in Ulysses in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland as some kind of a shrunken figure who nevertheless sees everything, knows everything, is a messenger from some other world. Okay. And this is a question, and the woman asks Buck Milligan, the medical quality, the medical knowledge of Buck Milligan is foregrounded over here. Well, she asks him a question. Are you a medical student, sir? The old woman asks. I am, ma'am. Buck Milligan answered. Look at that now, she said. Stephen listened in a scornful silence. She bows her old head to a voice that speaks to her loudly, her born setter, her medicine man. Me, she slides, to the voice that will shrive in oil for the grave all that there is for her but her woman's unclean loins of man's flesh, made not in God's likeness, but the serpent's prey. And to that loud voice, what now bids her to be silent with wandering, unsteady eyes. Do you understand what he says? Stephen asked her. Is it French you're talking, sir? The old woman said to Haynes. Haynes spoke to her again in a longer speech, confidently. Irish, Buck Milligan said. Is it Gaelic on you? I thought it was Irish, she said, by the sound of it. Are you from the West, sir? I'm an Englishman, Haynes answered. He's English, Buck Milligan said, and he thinks we ought to speak Irish in Ireland. Now, this becomes a very important question, a language question, and these are certain sections in Ulysses which makes it actually very interesting in post-colonial equality. So just read this and I'll end with this and we'll unpack this a bit. Sure, we ought to, the old woman said, and I'm ashamed I don't speak the language myself. I'm told it's a grand language by them that knows. Grand is no name for it, said Bob Milligan, wonderful entirely. Fill us some more tea, Kinch. We'd like a cup, ma'am. No, thank you, sir, the old woman said, slipping the ring of the milk can on the forearm and about to go. Haynes said to her, have you your bill? We'd better pay her, Milligan, hadn't we? Stephen filled her with 3 cups. Bill, sir, she said, halting. Well, it's 7 mornings, a pint at 2 pence, and 7 twos, a shilling, and 2 pence over, and 3 mornings, and a quart and 4 pence is 3 quarts and is a shilling. That's a shilling, and 1 or 2 is 2 and 2, sir. So she does this very complicated calculation at the time of billing. But just before that, the whole idea of the language politics becomes interesting because the Englishman thinks that the Irish should speak Irish in England, in Ireland, and that's obviously a very naive assumption on the part of the Englishman who actually was a colonizer. And the Irishman, of course, are speaking in English, but in a very intoned English, with an accent, which is definitely not the British accent. And that obviously irritates the Englishman. So the Englishman over the Haynes over here is a troublemaker. Haynes over here is a person who doesn't quite fit in. He's a incongruous, incompatible presence over here. And he's saying to those Irish people that because you're Irish, you ought to speak in Irish, the pure language. The old woman over here agrees sentimentally with Haynes' suggestion, but she says that that's that's a language which you don't speak anymore. It's a grand language. So, that assumption on the part of the colonizer that the colonized should speak their own language and not English, it obviously becomes a very problematic assumption, because that becomes that also translates into a question of ownership on language. He owns the language, so English becomes the language of the British only, and Irish ought to speak Irish, so to speak. So any idea of appropriation becomes problematic from the colonizer's perspective. So the colonizer doesn't quite like that a colonized subject speak in English, which happens to be the original tongue. Now this, of course, is a very complicated and very long drawn-out political debate to be had, but suffice it to say that the whole novel Ulysses is written in English, of course, and it's written in a kind of English which decimates or deconstructs the grand narrative about English writing and the novel English, the English writing which informs the novel. That becomes decimated, that becomes deconstructed, and it's very act of writing Ulysses. So, so this language question becomes very much part of the post-colonial debate over here. Okay, and then of course she makes this complicated calculation as a shilling and 1 or 2 is 2 and 2 is up. Buck Mulligan sighed, and having filled his mouth with a crust thickly buttered on both sides, stretched forth his legs and began to search his trouser pocket. So again, this becomes, those of you who are Joyce fans, who are Ulysses fans, would know, there are a lot of questions, quiz questions about Ulysses, and there's some trivia about Ulysses. And one question which keeps getting asked all the time is that when Buck Mulligan was having his bread, which side did he butter? And the correct answer would be both sides, thickly buttered on both sides. So stretched forth his legs and began to search his trouser pockets. Pay up and look pleasant, Haynes said to him, smiling. Stephen filled a third cup, a spoonful of tea colouring faintly the thick, rich milk. Buck Mulligan brought up a florin, twisted it around his fingers, and cried a miracle. He passed it along the table towards the old woman, saying, "Ask nothing or more of me, sweet. All I can give you, I give." Stephen laid the coin in an uneager hand. "We'll owe 2p," he said. "Time enough, sir," he said, taking the coin. "Time enough. Good morning, sir." She curtsied and went out, followed by Buck Mulligan's tender chant, "Heart of my heart, where it were, more would be laid at your feet." Okay, so this episode becomes interesting, and I'll end at this point today. The arrival of the milk woman as some kind of a mythical messenger who comes in to deliver milk, and a small conversation which also becomes quite political in quality. So she is both mythical as well as political in quality. So she's someone who appears in terms of appearance as a mythical messenger, but an entire dialogue about language, about the Irish language and the English language becomes quite political in quality. And of course, the whole idea of owing money to the messenger becomes sort of quasi-mythical again. And she departs. The departure is quite cryptic in quality. She comes, delivers milk goes away quite quickly. And the 3 students away have this very interesting conversation with her, which makes the entire episode quasi-mythic in quality, as well as being quite political in quality. So I'll stop at this point today, but I hope to have established by now that Ulysses is a novel which draws on a mythical frame, the mythical method, but actually deals with the very earthly now, the earthly reality of Dublin, in which it is very stubbornly situated, right? And the stubborn situatedness of Ulysses is something which we must never lose sight of, because it actually becomes a very coarse, filthy, earthly novel, and the filthy quality, the earthly quality, the scatological quality of Ulysses is part of the complexity, is part of the narrative complexity, is part of the scandal, so to speak, which makes it such a scandal in English imagination, and the entire not just in a mortal map of England and Ireland, but also in the linguistic map of England and Ireland. Because if you remember the lecture before this, prior to this, when I started off with this background of the novel, I said that this was bound on 2 counts. One, of course, was obscenity, it foregrounded the body, the sexuality of the body, the defecation quality of the body. I mean, the different kinds of functionality of the body was foregrounded, and there's nothing concealed. The body was very much part of the narrative process. And also the second count due to which it got banned, the scandal arose, was due to obscurity. It was written in a language which is not really English in that sense. So it was a rewriting of the English language. It was a deconstruction of the English language, which became part of the scandal. So this episode, which we stopped at today, it sort of throws light on some of the bigger concerns, Ulysses, which we'll take up in the times to come. So I'll stop at this point today. I'll continue with the lecture of this particular text in the coming lectures. Thank you for your attention.